Hi there, this is Lecture 18 in Social Neuroscience, Us and Them, Part 2. When I see that title, Us and Them, I think about this really great Pink Floyd song, On the Dark Side of the Moon. I wish I could play it here, but we know how YouTube would be about the copyright protection. But if you ever get a chance, go look up Us and Them on YouTube. It's or wherever by Pink Floyd. It's a great song. It sort of captures some of the elements of these two lectures. All right, in the previous lecture in part 1, I talked about a little bit about some of the basic processes that underlie prejudice, and today we're going to really get into the heat of it. We're going to look more at exactly what prejudice is, how we measure it. So we're going to talk about measuring prejudice through self-reports, implicit measures, somatic markers. We'll talk about prejudice and discrimination because very often we're really interested in prejudice because it's related to behavior, and the behavior that prejudice guides is called discrimination. And then we'll put it all together in some research that I haven't published yet about how trust, that we talked about at the previous lecture, and categorization processes and prejudice can all be put together. So let's take the first one. How do we measure prejudice? Now, prejudice is thought by social psychologists to be an attitude. So for many, many decades, it was thought of as an attitude, just like other attitudes we might have about political beliefs, about how we feel about ATMs, how we feel about climate change. And so you might have seen this model before, the tripartite model of attitudes that says that an attitude has both cognitive processes and affective processes, but it also has behavioral processes. So there's behaviors associated with attitudes. So you can see prejudice as being partly behavior because of discrimination. Prejudice is sometimes looked at for the affect part of it, the emotions that underlie the prejudice. And the cognitive processes have usually been thought about as having to do with the categorization or the stereotyping processes that underlie all of this. Now, if that's the way we think about prejudice, that it's like an attitude, then another thing that you'll see when you look at the attitude literature is that there are measurements of attitudes that are both implicit and explicit. And so the idea is that attitudes reflect dissociated representations, things that are in your mind about how you're supposed to feel or respond to certain things. And automatic processes activate implicit attitudes. So when you are in a situation that maybe just signals that an attitude is relevant, automatic processes are going to activate what's called the implicit attitude. Whereas controlled processes activate explicit attitudes. So when you're conscious and deliberating and have to report your attitude or think about it, that would be an explicit attitude. So you can think a little bit about how you would measure each of those. How do you measure automatic or implicit attitudes, and how do you measure explicit attitudes? This distinction between automatic and controlled, or between implicit and explicit measurements of attitudes, is fairly recent. It's only been since the late 90s that we've really talked about it this way. Well before that, to measure prejudice, people would just use self-reports. So that would be a conscious, deliberate, controlled process, an explicit measure of prejudice. And there are lots of ways to do this. You can just ask people how they feel about a group. They can rate them on a scale, how warm or cold they feel towards the person. You can also give them Likert scales. So here's Likert, the guy who invented the Likert scale, has these items that you indicate how much you agree or disagree with them. And you can just say, like I believe that church is the greatest institution in our nation today. So if you have a positive attitude about the church, you would give it a 1. If you have a negative attitude, you give a 5. And you continue answering other statements, making ratings there about how much you agree or disagree with them. And this was supposed to give you an explicit measure of your attitude. And you could put the same thing in here for some particular racial group or ethnic group or gender or any group that you're particularly interested in measuring prejudice. You can use Likert scales. Now, this is a good way to measure prejudice. Very direct. Just ask people how they feel. But of course, one of the problems with explicit measures of prejudice is that in this climate today, it might not be socially acceptable for you to give your opinion about a particular group, particularly if that group is somebody that is sort of protected, or it's not socially appropriate for you to express negative attitudes towards that group. For instance, in sport, it's very easy to go ahead and say, I really don't like that other team. I hate them. They're awful. That's acceptable, right? So you could give your explicit attitude about how you feel toward another rival sporting team. But for a racial or ethnic group, that might not be socially acceptable to do. And so therefore it's considered racist or something else. And so you don't want to do that. So therefore you might not actually give your explicit rating of how you feel about that particular group. So that's why a lot of social psychologists turn to implicit measures. And probably the most popular implicit measure that's used today to look at things like prejudice is the IAT, or the Implicit Association Test. And you can find the IAT on different websites. I'm pretty sure that this website is still available like this, that's on implicit.harvard.edu. It was developed at a couple different universities, and I think these different universities all might have some version of it on there being hosted, but I think Harvard is the last place I looked that still had the IAT on it. There are many different kinds of implicit association tests that you can take. This particular one was developed way back in the day when Barack Obama was running against John McCain in the United States for the presidency. And so the idea was that instead of asking people exactly how do they feel about Barack Obama or John McCain, they could go ahead and take this implicit measure. And so what you would do is you'd see a picture like this, and you're supposed to tap like the left key, that's Barack Obama, the right key if it's John McCain. Very easy, so you see pictures of John McCain or Barack Obama and make those quick categorizations. Or you might be told that, hey, if it's Barack Obama or something good, an object that's a good object, press the left key. If it's John McCain or something bad, press the right key. And the idea here is that that's more difficult to do that'd be easy to do if you have positive attitudes towards Barack Obama. So if you have a positive attitude towards Barack Obama, you can tell yourself, hey, all the good things are on the left. Barack Obama or anything good, I'll be pressing the left key. John McCain, I don't like him, or anything bad, that's on the right. And so it's easy for you to keep track of it, and it'll be easy for you then to make distinctions between the left and the right key. But imagine you mess it up a little bit and you say, okay, Barack Obama or anything bad would be on the left key. John McCain or anything good would be on the right key. And let's say that you have a very positive attitude towards Barack Obama. Well, if you have a positive implicit attitude towards Barack Obama, it's going to be harder for you to make distinctions then when it's like these decisions about pressing the left or the right key, if you have to remember that Barack Obama, good, and anything else that's bad is on the left key. John McCain, who is bad, or anything that's good, is on the right key. And if you have to keep making that, it's going to take you longer. And so the amount of time that you took on the IAT is supposedly going to tell us how good or how badly you feel about whatever the target object is. And as I said, you can do this for different political figures. You can do it for racial groups, ethnic groups. You can do it for fast food versus healthy food, anything you're interested in measuring an attitude. So the IAT isn't really just only for measuring prejudice, but it's very often used these days as an implicit measure of prejudice. So take it yourself if you haven't ever done so. You can go find that implicit association test online somewhere. Now, how does this all relate to other things, other measures of attitudes? And this is an interesting study. This was published in 2006 by Knudsen et al., where they looked at political attitudes using the IAT and fMRI. So what they did is they found strongly identified Democrats and Republicans in the US who looked at pictures and names of well-known politicians in an fMRI scanner. They also had them complete an IAT measure. So besides looking at these pictures, they also completed an IAT. And they found that the amygdala and the fusiform gyrus were active while they looked at these faces. But they also had trials where they had names, and they didn't see the amygdala and the fusiform become activated when they just looked at names of these politicians. These areas in particular, though, were correlated with the valence of the participants' attitude towards the politician, their IAT score, and the participants' identification with their party. So the implicit measure here was the IAT, and how they felt towards the politician on the IAT, kind of like the way I just showed you with Barack Obama and John McCain. And also they had an explicit measure of their identification with their party, how much they thought of themselves as a Democrat or a Republican. And they found that those two measures, the implicit and the explicit measures, were related to amygdala and fusiform gyrus activity while they were processing these faces. And specifically, when they looked at a rival group, like they're a Democrat and they look at a Republican, they saw more amygdala activity when they looked at their outgroup. So that tells you that a little bit about how you could use fMRI even to measure attitudes towards political groups. Okay, so there we go. We covered self-reports. We've covered implicit measures like the IAT. The last thing I want to go ahead and just mention is somatic markers. Somatic markers are physiological markers, basically. And this is a model of prejudice I've been kicking around for several years now. I've never actually published it, but it's just a way that my research gets sort of organized around it. And it's just a way of kind of keeping track of how physiological measures might come into play. So in this somatic marker model of prejudice, I conceptualize prejudice as a bodily change that results from the mere presence or thought about an outgroup member. And this is very much inspired by Damasio's somatic marker hypothesis that you might remember, about how we get these little gut feelings about whether or not we should make a decision. And do you remember how some of these patients that Damasio has worked with have damage like in the orbital frontal areas that cause them to not really read their gut very well, and they end up making bad decisions. So I'm likewise arguing here that sometimes when you run into people from the outgroup, you might have a somatic marker. You have a little physiological change, a little gut response, right? And so prejudice then is viewed as more like a temporary state, something that you just momentarily have when your body kicks back and gives you this sort of feedback. Now, how do all those other things we just talked about fit in? Well, I think things like the IET, which measure associations you might have with a particular racial group or ethnic group, or stereotypes or attitudes that you may have already beforehand, all of those things would feed into your somatic marker. They become like this automatic way that you're going to respond whenever you see this particular outgroup. And by the way, this can also work for gender and other measures of sexuality and other categorizations that we make besides just race and ethnicity. And then the somatic markers themselves in turn affect things like how you're going to further think about that group in terms of new stereotypes and attitudes. It affects your decisions you're going to make about them. It can affect your discriminatory behavior. It can go ahead and guide your behavior according to this somatic marker model. So again, what is a somatic marker? Well, essentially, it's an emotional response with one or more of the following as its basis. That there's some sort of visceral or physiological activity like skin conductance, okay, or heart racing, changing, expressions in your face, smiling, frowning, showing a disgust response, and behaviors and postures like leaning towards or leaning away from the group or the person that is in that group. All of these would be basically bodily changes that you're making in response to being in the presence of this outgroup member that would then feed back into your brain and tell you a little bit more about how you actually feel about people in that group. Now, in my laboratory, one of the main ways that we look at somatic markers is to use facial EMG. So we talked about this back in lecture 2, so you can measure smiling and frowning by putting electrodes on the skin over different muscles, and you can get things like the corrugator muscle that you use when you furrow your eyebrows. You have the zygomaticus when you smile. And so in fact, that's how I got into using physiological measures in my PhD, was using them to measure prejudice. Okay, so let me go ahead and show you a little bit more about this. So first of all, I just want to go ahead and talk just a little bit more about some evidence of somatic markers. And besides my EMG measure, just to tell you that there's lots of work that shows that you can measure prejudice this way. So for instance, Rankin and Campbell back in 1955, Poirier and Lott. What these people did is they actually used skin conductance activity. So they measured how much sweating there was on the fingertips or on the palm when an outgroup member was present. Rankin and Campbell, for example, conducted their study in the American South back in the 1950s, and these white participants that were being hooked up with physiological measures either had an African American or a white American experimenter attach the electrodes, and they found that when the African American was putting these electrodes on, that the participants actually showed much bigger responses. So they seemed to be having a sort of a gut negative physiological response being in the presence of this outgroup member. Similarly, in 1997, I used facial EMG in one of my first studies to demonstrate that when whites looked at pictures of black and white faces, that these white participants actually could show prejudice in their face. That is, they would frown more when they looked at black faces and smile more when they looked at white faces. And this was moderated by their explicit attitudes that they had about African Americans. So those people who reported having more negative attitudes about African Americans were the ones that actually showed more prejudice on their face. And then finally, Blaskovich et al. In 2001 used another kind of somatic marker measure, which was they used impedance cardiography. They put electrodes on the chest, like you see here, to measure heart rate, blood pressure, and cardiac output, and other kinds of things to look at a cardiovascular pattern. And basically, they found that when people imagined or actually worked with out-group members, they would show cardiovascular patterns that were consistent with what has been called a threat pattern. So when you're feeling sort of threatened by a particular task, you have a particular cardiographic way of responding versus when you just feel sort of challenged by something. So people actually felt threatened. They had a physiological response in their impedance cardiography there that happened when they were with out-group members. All right, so now that we understand how we can measure prejudice, let's look a little more at how prejudice and discrimination go together. And we can kind of use this model that I have here, this SMP, to kind of look at this, because I'm saying that somatic markers are a way to link the things up at the top with the things down at the bottom, right? So they determine how associations, stereotypes, and attitudes are formed, as well as our decisions and discriminatory behaviors. So here's a study where I went ahead and recorded IAT. So I measured IAT in my participants. So that's measuring the associations. I also measured my somatic marker, which was the EMG. And finally, I measured discriminatory behavior. So I had all three things here. And remember, we should be able to then see that EMG will do a good job of predicting discriminatory behavior. The IAT, by the way, will only predict discriminatory behavior if it also kind of goes through that intervening variable EMG, but we should find, though, that EMGs can be the better predictor for discriminatory behavior according to this particular model. So in 2004, I had this paper published in Psychological Science, and what we did was we measured, like I said, the IAT in our participants. We also had facial EMG to look at their prejudice, and we also gave them a discrimination task. Now, I had to have this particular study to run in a sort of opposite order of events that you might think, because we didn't want our participants to be feel that we were actually measuring their prejudice and their discrimination, because they would just maybe go ahead and hide it from us if they knew what we were actually doing. So here's what we did. I was at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia at the time, and these were all white undergraduate students. They had all completed measures earlier in the semester that gave me an idea of what their motivations to control prejudice were like, whether or not they actually showed any racism on a scale. And I can just tell you that these particular participants at Emory, it was sort of a very left-wing progressive kind of university at the time, that these students were very, very low on the modern racism scale, and they were very motivated to make sure they didn't look prejudiced, okay? Then when they actually came to the study, we conducted the study in two phases with different experimenters in the two locations, and it all occurred about 3 weeks apart. And so the participants didn't realize that these two experiments were actually linked until we told them afterwards. So in phase one, what happened was that the participants would complete a IAT, a black-white race IAT, so we could actually measure their implicit measure of prejudice. And then the other thing they did at that particular phase is they would choose the best applicant for a graduate teaching fellowship. That became our discrimination measure. And then in phase two, when they came back about 3 weeks later, they viewed pictures of white and black students from yearbooks while we recorded their facial EMG. So let me take these two phases and break them down further for you. At the teacher evaluation, or the IAT phase, what happened was after they had completed the race IAT, so they just sat there in front of the computer making those left-right button presses, very similar to what I just showed you with John McCain and Barack Obama. After they completed that, then they would read recommendation letters and a biographical information sheet for 3 applicants for a department teaching fellowship. Now, we told them these weren't actually really the people that were applying for these teaching fellowships, but they were very similar to them. So we didn't want them to believe that we actually had real people's folders here with real photos. And so instead what we did was we made them sort of look like they were real ones, and we gave them photos of 2 whites and 1 black so that they had 3 possible people that they could evaluate and recommend for the teaching fellowship. 2 of them were white and 1 of the applicants was black. Now the participants were then asked to choose the most qualified candidate and to make some other ratings about each applicant's qualifications. We made sure that the applications themselves were all really competitive. There really wasn't anything special about any one of them, but we mixed up the pictures so that overall we had kind of counterbalancing across these picture application combinations. And then it says here then they completed the IAT, but they actually completed the IAT before that. So I'm not sure why I have that listed there. I'm sorry. I apologize for that little edit there. And then approximately 2 to 3 weeks after they had participated in that teacher evaluation phase, they were recruited by a different experimenter for the second phase of the study. which was ostensibly unrelated to the first testing phase. So they came back to the second experiment. So basically what we did is we kind of put up an eligibility list. If they happened to be in the first experiment, we hoped that they would sign up for our second experiment. And so that meant that we actually tested a few hundred people in the first experiment, only got 35 of those first couple hundred people to actually sign up for our second experiment. And then that's how we got 35 people in this overall study. And so then what we did is we showed them pictures of white faces and black faces from high school yearbooks, and we recorded their facial EMG, how much smiling and frowning they had when they looked at each of those faces. Now, when you look at that facial EMG activity, then we would expect that people who have somatic markers of prejudice towards African Americans, these white participants, are going to frown more and smile less when they see a picture of a black high school senior than they are when they see a white one. And when they see a white high school senior, they should smile more and frown less, right? Because their face is like a somatic marker that's giving us an indication of their implicit prejudice, or their somatic marker of their prejudice. So that's what we did. We ended up dividing our participants into those who showed bias in their face and those people who didn't show bias in the face. In fact, some of the people who didn't show bias in their face even showed bias in the opposite direction. That is, they actually smiled more when they looked at African American faces, and they frowned more when they looked at white faces. So those people were just all put together with anybody else who didn't show any bias on their face. Okay? So then what we could do is we could say, all right, do we see a relationship between this measure, this somatic marker, and who they picked for their teaching application? Okay? So if you go back and think about that, we had 3 applicants and they were supposed to choose the best one. So just by chance, remember one of them was an African American applicant and the other 2 were white. So just by chance, if there was no bias whatsoever, we'd expect that about 1/3 of our participants would pick a black applicant and about 2/3 would pick a white applicant, right? Now, what if we look on the EMG 3 weeks later? Those people who are basically showing sort of no preference, or in fact show a more positive preference for black people, what do? Well, they were the ones that were more likely to choose a black applicant than a white applicant. So you can see that they're actually going twice as much for chance picking a black applicant than they were to pick a white applicant. The people who had more of a pro-white bias, more prejudice against African Americans, they actually significantly were more likely to choose a white applicant, greater than chance, for that teaching fellowship. So you can see that their somatic marker that they're showing us 3 weeks later predicted pretty well to what they did when they were actually giving a chance to evaluate and make decisions on these applications. What about the IAT? And remember, I told you the IAT is supposedly measuring some implicit associations or an implicit attitude about people, right? And so we did find that our participants could be divided up on the IAT the same way. That is, they could be divided up into those who showed an IAT bias in favor of whites, and also we found some of our white participants could actually show an IAT bias that favored blacks. So it turned out that this wasn't exactly a one-to-one with the facial EMG. There was a moderately positive correlation between these two things. So that is, the people who showed a more white IAT bias were the ones, they were more likely, there was a more of a chance that they were also the ones that showed the EMG, but it wasn't a one-to-one. I'm trying to say it's not 100% the same people in the two groups, okay? So there's a moderate relationship between the two, but they're not exactly the same. Anyway, what happened? So remember, by chance, we would expect that 1/3 of those people who have an IAT bias are going to do a black applicant. 2/3 should choose a white applicant if they don't actually have any bias when they pick the applications. On the IAT, though, you can see that we didn't actually get any effect. That is, the IAT grouping, how they did on the IAT test, which was done actually at phase 1 at the same time that they also had done their picking of the applications. We didn't find any relationship between how they did on the IAT and who they picked. Now, what I think that means is that perhaps the IAT is actually measuring people's associations, but whether or not you act on those associations depends on whether or not you also have a somatic marker, that you actually have a gut negative response that goes along with whatever your associations are. So I think the associations that the IAT pick up are independent of whether or not you actually have a somatic marker of prejudice, or that you actually have prejudice that way, because I think it's just really measuring those kind of cultural negative associations we might have with different groups, and the IAT can measure that, but doesn't necessarily tell us the gut feeling that a person has that might affect their behavior later on. So that's our paper from 2004. Now I'll tell you about one other study that kind of looked at this. This is these sorts of relationships, and this is not from my lab. This one, they kind of looked at stereotypes and somatic markers of prejudice and decision making, okay? And it involved fMRI as well. And so this is a phenomenon that was a paradigm that was developed by Malia Mason here, Malia Mason's at Columbia University, and it was her research group that first started doing this stuff on what's called racial paralysis. It's a really kind of interesting phenomenon, a thing that you could do, where basically you'd look at two pictures like this and you're supposed to make a decision. Which one of these two people is more hardworking? So again, it's just based on those simple first impressions, right? You're making a quick automatic decision about which one of these two people looks more hardworking. Now let's say I go ahead and give you a different pair and a different question. And this question is, which one of these two people is more reliable? The guy on the left or the guy on the right? Now you'll notice that this time what I've done is I've picked a white face and a African-American face. And the question about reliability turns out to be something that is involved in the cultural stereotype that Americans have about African-Americans, that they're not as reliable as white people are. And because of that, then this question becomes sort of a stereotype relevant decision about which one of these two people is more reliable. In the actual study, what they do is they do it this way. They'll say the term up at the top, like reliable, and then you have to decide whether one is what you think goes on with reliable, that guy over on the left is reliable, or three is one who's reliable. Or if you can't make a decision between the two, you can opt to pick I have no gut feeling. You can pick number two. This way, you can kind of get yourself removed from having to make a decision that might make you look like you're racist, or that you have some sort of stereotype about African Americans. So they went ahead and gave people this way of responding where you can pick one or three, or if you don't have any gut feeling at all, you can pick number two. If you pick number two, they call that racial paralysis, because it's going to happen, according to them, more often when you have a stereotype relevant trait and you're making cross-racial comparisons. You're kind of like deciding between somebody in your own group if you're a white person, or somebody from the other group if you're African American, and therefore you're making this cross-race decision on something that's stereotype relevant, and so therefore you might choose to have no gut feeling. It's like a racial paralysis, they call it. So in this study, the one that I'm talking about here from 2013, they did actually find this. So they found that if people were making stereotype trait decisions, okay, like the word reliable up at the top, but it was between two people of the same race, no problem. People could make a choice, left or the right person. Same thing with non-stereotype traits, right? So non-stereotype traits, there shouldn't have any racial paralysis at all. But if the person's making a decision between two people of different races, they have to decide whether the black guy or the white guy is the one that's relevant to that trait. If it's a stereotype trait that's relevant to African Americans, people have racial paralysis. They opt not to make a decision between the two, and that's why the blue bar there on the right is so low. Whereas if it's a non-stereotype trait, it's just the same amount of frequency that they're likely to do this as they would in a same race pairing. All right, so this is something that they had already found in previous research, but now they wanted to show that what was going on in the brain when people have racial paralysis. So what you see here is in this Norton et al. Study is what brain activity happens while they're making these kinds of decisions. And so you can see we have cross-racial decisions or same-race decisions, and whether or not the word up at the top is irrelevant or the word at the top is stereotype relevant, right? And you can see that really it doesn't make much of a difference whether it's cross or same, that for stereotype relevant traits, they're always higher, whether it's a cross or a same, higher in activation in the ACC, the right dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, or the left ventrolateral prefrontal cortex. So all three of those areas, they found an effect of anytime that you're making a judgment about somebody and it has to do with relevant content, stereotype relevant content, that causes these areas to become more active. But nothing played out in terms of whether or not it was a cross-racial comparison or a same-race comparison. Where they found that mattered was in the ventral medial prefrontal cortex. So you can see here that in the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, we get something that looks similar to what would happen with the self-report stuff, where they actually had to make a choice. And so you can see here that when they have to make a decision, a cross-racial decision about something that's stereotype relevant, they get less activation in the ventral medial prefrontal cortex there, and it's significantly lower than it is for the other three conditions, which all have changes in ventral medial prefrontal cortex equally. So what we're getting is less ventral medial prefrontal cortex because people are opting out. They don't want to make that racial decision. And so because it's sort of like something that they rather not do, they sort of like stop the processing of it, right? So you're getting a difference in the processing compared to the other three conditions. So that's a really interesting paradigm. It's something that I came across a few years ago. I haven't actually seen too many people use it, but I think it's actually got a lot of promise and could be really interesting for other kinds of categories. So again, if you have any questions about this particular study, I'd go and find it. It's a really interesting and easy study to read. Now, I want to go ahead and put together stuff from the previous lecture with the things that we've been talking about this lecture. And I'm going to do it by talking about trustworthiness, social categorization, and prejudice all at once, all right? So you remember that one of the things we talked about last time was how brain activity differed by trustworthiness ratings, right? So we saw in this particular study that amygdala activation was higher for low trustworthy faces, and for high trustworthy faces, there was hardly any amygdala or right insula activity, right? And so right and left amygdala were both greater for less trustworthy faces, and fusiform gyrus showed more activity for less trustworthy, and none of these regions were affected by the implicit versus the explicit task, correct? All right, now, here's what happened in a study that I conducted. So this is a study that we ran about 5 or 6 years ago. We haven't actually got this paper published yet because we need some more data, and we just because of various reasons haven't been able to collect the rest of the data. But here's basically a preliminary report of what we did. So we used very similar faces to what other researchers have used. This is a data set of a bunch of faces that have been rated beforehand about how trustworthy they look. Okay, so some of these faces look more trustworthy, other faces look less trustworthy. There's dozens of these pictures that we could use. And what we did in our study is we went ahead and added a little square in the corner and said that this person's either on the red team or on the blue team. And then the participant wore a t-shirt that was on the blue team or the red team. So we gave them a t-shirt to wear during the study, and we said, you're on the blue team or you're on the red team. And so now you're gonna look at pictures like this and you see people who are on the red team or the blue team. Okay, so your task is just to simply look at them and make ratings about how positive and negative they look, right? So if you think about this interestingly, we have trustworthiness, again, implicit, because we don't ask them to rate how trustworthy anybody looks. We're just gonna use ratings of trustworthiness that other researchers have done with this particular data set. So what would you predict? What do you think is going to happen in terms of how does it make a difference, whether that person's in your in-group or your out-group, based on how trustworthy the face is? So if you kind of look at this, we looked at Todorov had actually already created these stimuli and had already rated them how trustworthy and untrustworthy they were. And so you can see this is sort of a percent of the participants who view that face as trustworthy. So the ones that are most trustworthy have the highest number of participants who think they're trustworthy. The ones that are really untrustworthy looking faces, very few people will actually pick them as looking trustworthy. Well, one thing that we could predict is that maybe what happens is when you see an outgroup, it just causes you to be more biased if you know that that's a different color from you, like you're on the blue team, they're on the red team, that because they're in the outgroup, maybe what happens is you just overall don't trust any of those people, right? And it could be then that the in-group gets a bias in favor of them, where you maybe trust them more. Okay, so what's interesting about this is that if you kind of cross in-group, out-group with how trustworthy they are, you could expect that at a particular point here that we could see a difference that you would expect is sort of like the effect of being an in-group or an out-group. And by the way, keep in mind that these are just minimal groups. Like we're not even talking about race. Everybody in the picture is just this white person that's in the photograph. There's nothing that varies about the race of the people in the pictures. We're just putting a red or a blue square there and then assigning randomly the participant to the red or the blue team. And just simply by calling them the in-group or the out-group, we're kind of expecting that maybe we'll see these kinds of biases. So what actually happened? We showed these pictures to our participants and asked them to rate how trustworthy they look. And you can see that these are the pictures of the people who are in their in-group, and you can see that overall they do actually show more higher ratings of trustworthiness overall compared to pictures that are just neutral. And those pictures that are from the out-group, from the opposite team, get rated slightly less trustworthy overall. So there's like this bias that's just being imposed on the overall curve of trustworthiness of the person's face. So not only is the face telling us about trustworthiness, but also whether the person's in the in-group or the out-group is telling us about trustworthiness, and that's feeding into their ratings here. So overall, what we saw was that in the in-group, we get more trust there than we do for the out-group. And you can see that for those faces that are the highest in trust, the ones that naturally look really trustworthy, the in-group, out-group distinction isn't as big as it is for those faces that are really low in trust. Those are where we see the biggest differences between the in-group and the out-group. Now, we also did this study with EMG. So we actually measured their smiling and frowning activity. And a couple of things popped out in this study. What we found was that in the oculi, which is this muscle that you use when you smile genuinely, you can see that when it's the in-group and you're showing somebody that it's a trustworthy face, they get more oculi. They're smiling more to in-group members who look really trustworthy compared to in-group members who are not so trustworthy. Okay? So the in-group, just looking at overall how the face looks in terms of how trustworthiness is affected by how trustworthy it is in a way that you might expect. But in the out-group, what's interesting is that the ones that they show the least amount of oculi to, the ones that they show the least amount of positive affect to, are the people who are in the high trust out-group. And it could be because they're in the out-group and they kind of look trustworthy. They're kind of confusing to us because we want the out-group to be people we don't trust very much, right? That's what we're going to be motivated for. So perhaps those people are troubling to us and we don't give them as much enjoyment or positive enjoyment to them. And similarly, interestingly, we found this with the zygomaticus, that in the in-group, those people who they trust the most are not the ones they smile the most to. They smile more to the people who are low trustworthy looking in the in-group. And perhaps this is because those people are slightly dangerous. You got people in the in-group who are kind of like sketchy looking, and maybe you smile more to them just to let them know, hey, it's okay, we're on the same team. And maybe that's why people are smiling more. And the out-group, is interesting that they also smile more to the high trustworthy faces and less to the low trustworthy faces. So those two groups, the ones that are in the middle there, the two bars in the middle, the in-group low trust and the out-group high trust, those two are the ones where you see this kind of increased smiling activity compared to the other type of trustworthiness within that group. And it may be that smiling is a way to appease people who are looking a little sketchy. We're not exactly sure yet, and this is one of the reasons why we need to collect more data. So you might notice then that our EMG reports are different from our self-report. So again, asking people to report how they feel about these people can be different from what you get on the face. And it's one of the reasons why I like using physiological measures in addition to self-report measures. Now, what about the brain? What do we know about that? Well, we know that from this study by Engel et al., it's very similar to that Winston et al. Study, that you do make these really automatic decisions about trust. And so they had these photos that are the same ones that I just showed you. They had them rated from the most trustworthy to the least trustworthy. And then they put them into the scanner and measured their amygdala activity. Yeah, so here you can see that when you look across all of their stimuli, from the ones that are the most trustworthy to the ones that are the least trustworthy, the ones that are the least trustworthy are the ones on the left. Those have a mean of 3.05. The ones that are most trustworthy are on the right. Those are the ones that have higher numbers. They're the most trustworthy. So the least trustworthy faces are the ones that actually cause more amygdala activity to happen. So they just look at that face, see it's untrustworthy, and they're showing more amygdala activity. Okay? And so they found that in both their left and right amygdala. We tried doing this as well. We had a very small sample. This was like a pilot study. And what we did is we showed them those same pictures with the red and the blue squares, and we had the red and the blue t-shirts. And we found amygdala activation as well, although we only found it in the left amygdala. And you can see here that when they're looking at somebody who is in the in-group, and they're not somebody you could trust very much, they showed more activity in the in-group to the low-trust people. And they showed more amygdala activity to people in the out-group in the high-trust condition. This is very similar to what I told you about what happened with the zygomaticus, with the smiling activity. It seems that those people who are at the boundary of our in-group and out-group in terms of their trustworthiness, you see that? See how like a person, again, who's in the in-group, who you can't trust very much because they don't look very trustworthy in their face, they're kind of sketchy and they make you sort of nervous even though they're in your in-group. People in the out group who are really trustworthy, they're also kind of sketchy because maybe they're going to trick me. They're trying to get into my group. And so those are the two groups I told you that we smile more to compared to the other group. These are also the ones that give us more amygdala activation in this study. And so again, this is all preliminary. It was really interesting to kind of put all of it together here to look at categorization, EMG, prejudice, and so on. But in this case, we are not going to publish it yet until we get some more data, but I just wanted you to kind of get an idea of how we would think about these things. So in sum, what we've done is we've talked about how we measure prejudice in all these different ways. We've talked about prejudice and discrimination and what, two different studies that looked at how prejudice and discrimination go together. And finally, we put it all together from the last two, this lecture and the previous one, about how trustworthiness, categorization, and prejudice can all work together, even for minimal groups where we just made up a red and a blue team. Keep in mind again that in the future lectures, we will be talking about these topics of us and them again, particularly when we're talking about things like empathy, we're talking about violence and aggression. You can't not think about us and them kind of distinctions when you're talking about those other topics as well. So I hope you're reading along in your Sapolsky book, and we'll see you at the next lecture.